Hi, it's Amy Shaw, the Soul Whisperer here. I have been on a little bit of a retreat. Sometimes that happens when you're in shamanic practice, you're a shamanic individual, you need to step back and take a little bit of a break and just retreat and transmute some things and come out stronger. And I'm at that point now where I've kind of gone down into the underworld, done a little bit of work. And I woke up this morning, I'm full of energy, I feel like I'm back in my power, I have a lot of things on my mind. And I've spent the last 2 or 3, maybe even 4 weeks considering, mulling over, sort of coalescing some different ideas and things that have been on my mind and that I definitely want to talk about. I feel compelled to make several videos while I have the time to do that this morning. So the first thing I want to talk about today is suffering. Suffering along the shamanic path and suffering as it relates to initiation. The reason that this is really fresh on my mind is because the shamanic community is surrounded pretty much on all sides by this new age spirituality, this higher consciousness. It's all around everywhere. And, anybody that's in, alternative spirituality, meaning like not the mainstream religious version of spirituality, will understand what I'm saying when I tell you that we're pretty much given the consistent message that suffering is a bad thing, that human beings should not want to suffer, that they shouldn't have to suffer, that they don't have to suffer, that it's just a matter of our perception, and if we shift our perception, we shift our perspective, we shift our reality, that we can somehow transcend suffering. So the goal in New Age spirituality seems to consistently be to transcend suffering or escape suffering or not even identify with suffering in any way. And from my personal experience, and I'm not trying to say like I'm the end-all be-all authority on shamanism, but I do know a lot about it, and I do know a lot of shamanic individuals. I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the process of initiation. And from my understanding of it, I do not think that transcending suffering is consistent with what shamanism is all about on any way. So first, let me talk about what shamanism is. I know I've made many videos talking about what shamanism is, but I just want to make it clear in this context of suffering. Shamanism is not a belief, it's not ideas, it's not a set of skills, it's not any of these things. It's not it's not like a religion per se. It's actually, to be a shaman is to be in a very specifically defined role within a very specific community. And so the actual role may take on a different form depending on the culture of that community. But it's a very specific role, in the same way that we have the role of a doctor or a teacher or a lawyer, these kind of things. They're very specific things that people do. So to actually be a shaman, to call yourself a shaman, you have to actually be in service, performing those tasks within that role. So it's not enough to just say, well, I talk to spirits, therefore I'm a shaman. You may be a shamanic initiate, you may be on the path, but the difference between an initiate and a shaman is that a shaman is consciously connecting their ego self with the role and providing a very specific service to their community. So now how this relates to this concept of suffering is in the process of initiation. Now, initiation can be really confusing to people that don't know, much about shamanism, or they don't know if they're shamanic initiate. And so, again, a lot of times you'll hear from the New Age community that we should be transcending suffering. We shouldn't be identifying with suffering. We should be trying to escape this. In the shamanic path, that's actually completely the opposite. Because to get from being an initiate, to get to being into a role of service, you have to go through decades and decades and decades of transmutation, of suffering, which produces all sorts of character traits that you need to be in shamanic practice. The chief one that I can think of is compassion. The helping spirits are compassionate spirits, and they're much more readily willing to assist and do the work, the shamanic work, if there's suffering involved, because they do have compassion. They have compassion on us. They see our suffering. They know they don't want us to suffer. But the goal of suffering, there's a tension there between not wanting to suffer anymore, because nobody wants to suffer, but also leaning into the suffering to allow it to do what it is intended to do. which is developed character. Suffering itself is sort of like an alchemical agent, whether it comes in the form of fire or water or any of the other elementals. Fire is probably the most typical one, you often hear like trial by fire. It burns off the impurities and helps somebody to become cleaner, clearer, more pristine, and less, I guess, entrenched in the ego. And so one of the things that suffering does is it brings up all these ego impulses, all these shadow impulses, and it provides us the opportunity to witness them, to work through them, essentially to bring light to them. And so suffering is just absolutely necessary. Now, some people will argue that. They will say that that's not the case. And, on the flip side of that, I will say that some people become addicted to suffering. And there are suffering spirits as well as there are compassionate spirits. And sometimes people can get enmeshed and attachments of suffering entities, and they can really bring a person down and create depression and this sort of addiction to suffering. So I'm not suggesting that shamanic people should be in that situation. What I'm really suggesting is that the relationship to suffering should not be one in which we're trying to transcend it or escape it. Perhaps transmute it, yes, but transmutation requires actually like leaning into the thing and working through so that you can glean out the gifts, the gold, the pearls that are contained within, and strengthen yourself, become more in your power, more whole, more complete, more compassionate, and gain the understanding and wisdom so that when somebody else who's gone through similar things or there's a similar dynamic happening, when they come into your field and they're asking for shamanic work, you have experience with this. You understand it and you know it. But there's no way to get experience without the suffering. And, this is not just Amy sitting here saying this. Essentially, this is a cross-cultural understanding of shamanism. It's universal. You can go into, just about any shamanic culture, and when they talk about initiation, some of these initiations are incredibly intense. Here in our Western culture, our initiations tend to kind of come organically from our life experience, whether that's like a near-death experience or, some type of terminal or life-threatening illness or some type of, massive injury or trauma of some kind. These are all aspects of initiation. In other cultures where they don't sort of live in this culture as we do, where the potential for that is as much, they tend to ceremonially actually create initiation processes. So sometimes this can look like being buried alive. Maybe a shaman is buried, 3 feet, 4 feet down into the ground, with nothing but a straw, connecting his mouth, sticking up out of the ground to the outside world, and he's required to stay there for a 24-hour period. That's one form of initiation. In the Amazonian jungle, there's some tribal cultures down there where shamanic initiation involves sending the initiate off into the jungle, no food, no water, to live by themselves essentially for 6-8 months, sometimes even 12. And if they can go and have that experience and make it back out of the jungle, back into the village, then, hey, you've succeeded, you've passed through initiation. In other cultures, in Iceland, they do the rock grinding, Anyway, I slightly got distracted for a minute there, but yeah, leaning into suffering. So it's really not so much that whether one is suffering or not suffering, it's one's orientation towards the suffering. That the goal should not be so much to transcend it, to escape it, to, shift the reality as if it's not happening, but to actually lean into it, to glean the gifts from it, to allow it to transmute and change. And the result of that ultimately will be that it develops empathy, it develops wisdom, it develops compassion, it develops insight, and all these sort of things. It purifies the spirit, it purifies the soul, and it creates empathy. One of the major fundamental differences between shaman and sorcerer, and I know people will get annoyed, like, why does she keep talking about sorcery? Well, because for myself personally, I have some karmic debt on that side of things, and part of my purpose, my soul purpose here, is to clear some of that karmic debt around sorcery, and to also not only hold myself in integrity here in this life with that, but also to promote that integrity in others who are in shamanic practice. And there is a fundamental difference. Michael Harner made a very clear distinction between shamanism and sorcery not being the same things. And he talked very bluntly and clearly and concisely about, Castaneda being more of a sorcerer than a shaman. And I think that I personally have not read the books, but I've heard some of the stories that are conveyed in the books. And to me, the stories that I've heard, again, secondhand, definitely I would say, yes, that is absolutely sorcery, because he didn't really come at it from a place of compassion, a place of empathy. And that is sometimes the clearest distinction between a sorcerer and a shaman. A sorcerer is more concerned with promoting self ideas, promoting self-belief, and furthering self. So sometimes people can have an intention of being a healer, but because they haven't cleared their shadow aspects yet, they're still very caught up in ego. And to just divert a little bit, to talk about ego, I'm not talking about ego in the same way that New Age people talk about ego. To me, in my shamanic path, ego is absolutely necessary. You have to have it. It's your self-identity. It's the driver of your bus. It's your operating system. So you do have to have that to some degree to be able to concentrate your energies and put them to use with the intention that you have to serve out your soul purpose here on this life. That's ego that does that. When I say that sorcerers often get caught up in ego, I'm not talking about that ego. I'm talking about pridefulness and arrogance and the shadow aspects of ego that causes, sort of separation, that sees oneself as all powerful, and that uses the magic, the skill, the knowledge, the insight to manipulate other people for their own gain. That is sorcery. And so going back to suffering, I would say that suffering is a necessary requirement for shamanic initiation. And sometimes initiation can be as short as just a decade long, but typically it's 2 or 3 and sometimes even 4 and sometimes even 5 decades long. And that's just to prepare somebody and get them ready to be of service. Even once you've entered full-on shamanic service, that like you are in the role and you are the thing and you've actually actualized that within yourself. You've done all the work and you've gone through all the suffering and you've transmuted and you're there, you're solid, you're there. Even still, you're going to continue to have initiations, because initiation doesn't stop. Essentially what initiation is, it's an introduction to a thing. So for example, even in shamanism, you have your shamanic initiation, which is really, really long and gets you to that point. And then once you're in service, you have initiation into different aspects, different experiences that will come and be brand new experiences. And that's your initiation into that thing. So maybe it's working with a certain kind of person, or doing a certain kind of work, a certain kind of, shamanic expression. It could be initiations into those kind of things, maybe like into ceremony, or maybe it's into shamanic extraction, or, these are all initiations. And then you have initiation into elderhood. I want to share a book about that really quick with you. It recently came and I'm excited to get to start to read it. Stephen Jenkinson is one of my personal mentors. And, he's a little rough around the edges sometimes, but I really adore his work, and I really appreciate it. So this is Come of Age, the case for elderhood in a time of trouble. And, he spends the book sort of making a case for the difference between being elderly and being an elder, and what the role of elder really truly means. And, that basically not everybody can just call themselves an elder. It actually is a role in a very specific way that looks and manifests itself. So if you're interested in advancing your understanding of elderhood, I highly recommend Stephen Jenkinson's work. I can't personally vouch for the entirety of the book yet. I've just read excerpts, but I'm getting ready to get started on this piece. But going back to the idea of initiation, yes, it continues to occur all throughout life. It doesn't essentially end at that point. But shamanic initiation itself, specifically shamanic initiation, that's the process or period that occurs that's preparing the person to be in the role. And if the difference between sorcery and shamanism is being ego-driven, being sort of self-centered, self-compelled, versus being humble and being in a place of service, a place of empathy, a place of compassion, then how does a person get from one to the other? The only way to get from one to the other, essentially, is through suffering, some form of suffering. Now, some people will say, well, we're in this age of enlightenment now, and now it's just a matter of consciousness. I wish that that was the case, but unfortunately, in my experience, it's not the case, because there are a lot of people that claim to be shamans who actually really are sorcerers. They're hurting people. They're doing things that are, not in integrity. They haven't cleared their shadow. They're projecting. They're stealing people's power away from them, and all sorts of things. And a lot of times people are doing these things and they're completely unconscious about it. So this is why I talk about sorcery, because it's so important. It's such an important aspect of integrity in shamanic practice, and it's the one thing I'm here to do, is to bring integrity to the practice. I've certainly been a shaman in many lives before this one. So in this particular life, this is what I bring, is integrity to the practice, and an unwavering sense of commitment to that, to the integrity of it. And so that requires me to talk about the ugly side of shamanism. The downside of shamanism is that a lot of sorcery goes on, a lot of sorcery occurs. And so today I really just wanted to stress the fact that suffering is necessary, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it. There's gifts in it. And, I don't think that my idea on it is so inconsistent with what the universal concept of shamanism is. If we even look at it in terms of an archetype, instead of like a very specific cultural stereotype of shamanism, we move away from the very specific initiation processes and all the different ways that suffering comes about through that. And we just look at the wider archetypal aspect of it. I think that the shaman often overlaps with the archetype of Christ, who absolutely, the Via Dolorosa was the way of suffering, the way of the cross. It was self-denial in service. Another aspect of that sort of overlaps with the shamanic archetype is the archetype of the bodhisattva, who is the enlightened being who comes to earth in agreement to continue to suffer as a human incarnate in order to serve other human beings. I think that essentially is even closer to the shamanic archetype in a lot of ways. And so, to be an enlightened being is not so much to transcend or escape the suffering, but to be in it, and to be able to tolerate and have compassion for and sit with people who are in pain, who are suffering, who are struggling, who maybe are confused. People that may be exhibiting, behaviors or beliefs or, things that we don't necessarily agree with, or that we find troubling, or that we, might tend to have impatience for if we're not in our compassion. And so the suffering sort of like clears all of that for us so that we can sit and be present with people that, maybe society is rejecting because they're going through things that are hard, or society in general does not allow room for suffering. It doesn't like suffering people. It doesn't tolerate suffering people. And so there's always this downward pressure, for suffering people that are in pain or people that are struggling to, sort of stifle it, to swallow it, to somehow, rid themselves of it because nobody wants to hear it. In shamanic practice, these are the people actually that we welcome to us, in the same way that Christ touched the lepers and he forgave the sinners and he loved the prostitutes and he, dined with the sinners, the people in poverty and the people with disease and the lame, the people that, couldn't walk and the people who were blind. And, by society standards, these people were not useful. They were rejected. These are the people that Christ loved. These are the people that he found fellowship with. And so for me in my shamanic practice, this is a very similar thing. A lot of times the people that come to me are very profoundly wounded, very profoundly affected. They have a lot of symptomology, really tough symptomology. And so that's another video that I'm going to make today, talking about specifically entity attachment. But before I do that, I want to read something from Tokapa Turner. She's another person that I consider a mentor. She, just is solid. She has a lot of integrity, a lot of wisdom, a lot of heart, a lot of compassion. These are the type of mentors that I tend to gravitate towards. They have that similar sort of signature, the shamanistic expression, with integrity and heart, compassion, and all these things. So I'm going to read a brief excerpt from her new book that she posted on her Facebook page recently. It says, "Welcome your own grief may take some practice because everything we are taught runs counter to this approach. Certainly it would be lovely to see more community spaces dedicated to grieving in the open so we could explore the depths of our grief knowing we are being held by a larger, supportive structure. But until then, we must learn to trust each other. We must learn to share our sacred ruins with one another, giving each other a chance to confirm that we are not alone. The events of your loss, the discrepancies in your upbringing, the deficits in your making are what shape you uniquely. Your limitations are what give rise to the imagination, and your regrets are what put you into right relationship with your future. So you must bless every grief you've encountered on your exquisite and treacherous courtship of self, for they've made you the slow diamond that you are. Like rain, the more excellently and prodigiously you grieve, the more growth and fertility you can expect. There is a future beyond the aridity and meaninglessness in our times that is teeming with life. If each of us has the tenacity to retrieve the elixirs of our discomforts, our combined medicine can heal the collective wound." Amen to that. So that is from Tokapa's new book, Belonging, Remembering Ourselves. I haven't gotten that one, but I've been reading her numerous daily excerpts from the book, and it is phenomenal. I can't wait to get it. I highly recommend it. I love how she uses words that are, very alchemical in nature. She talks about, making the slow diamond and the elixirs and, all of these types of things. It's very alchemical type of language. And, to me, it conveys that she really understands the transmutation process and she understands suffering. My shamanic elder, my teacher, is often saying that suffering makes sacred. Suffering itself is sacred. It's a sacred thing. And so to deny the sacredness of it, to make it somehow profane and to try to transcend it or escape it, in my understanding, that would be egregious. It would be egregious. And anybody, if you believe you're on a shamanic path and you're going through a period of suffering and somebody's telling you, oh, just, transcend that and you're in pain body and, sort of putting these sort of down labels on it, the shame around it and making it seem like there's something wrong with you or it's bad for you to be in that state, I would suggest you might consider that might not actually be the correct shamanic teacher for you. You really want a teacher that's going to sit with you, be with you in that space and guide you into actually leaning into that suffering to get the treasure out of it, the gold, the pearls, the diamonds, to bring back that, boon of that to your eventual tribe that you're going to be in service to. So that's my little bit on suffering and the shamanic initiation, the shamanic path today, and I hope that enlightens you. As always, if you have questions or comments, you're free to get a hold of me, and I love you guys so much. Have a really great day.